Hey guys, welcome back. So now, with jumping right back into Wolverine, I love where this first issue continues to go. And really, it's like for reasons aside from the obvious. Because woven into your main narrative, Percy also gives you like these little nuggets to think about. And with doing so, it really enhances the overall narrative. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping right back in to where we see Wolverine doing what he's been doing since the beginning of Dawn of X. Because really, if like you've noticed any other time before, like whenever he's not like actively involved in a mission, or like he just has free time out in Krakoa, like we find him usually out there just keeping himself on his toes. And I would say like staying in shape, but this is Wolverine, like does he need to? But rather, I would more so describe it as him just staying sharp. Because with so many unpredictable regions within Krakoa, he really views it as his own living obstacle course, or like a huge danger room. And even aside from like all the moving pieces on the island, like as a nation itself, it's something that's tricky to navigate as well. And this is one of those things I feel like everybody has thought about at some point, especially during House of X. Because when you just think of this idea of this great big island to where you have the most noble heroes just kicking it with the worst of the worst villains, just having a good old time. Like they ain't just tried to destroy the world a couple years ago. But at least with seeing Logan at least thinking of this, it's kind of comforting to know that at least everybody hasn't gone full trust fall as far as the population in Krakoa. And like even still with Logan, he considers a bit of optimism, like just a little bit, because with himself coming around after things he's done in the past, he knows that it's possible for others to do the same. And when he was thinking that, I'm sure the last person he had in mind was Omega Red. Because with Logan dashes across the island, only to meet Omega Red making his way through one of the Krakoan doors. Like from jump, Logan ain't having it. And if I remember correctly, we had seen back in House of X, at least where Omega Red had heard the invitation when Charles had granted amnesty to every mutant who wanted to come to Krakoa and make their new home. But Logan's like, nah, he don't get that. Like anybody but this guy. But with Magneto nearby, he stops Logan from attacking him by just holding him in midair. And to be honest, and at least in Logan's defense, it's his job to keep the people of Krakoa safe, and that's all he was really trying to do. Essentially, just do his job. But instead, Magneto then throws Wolverine through the gate, and with doing so, more or less telling him that if you want to do your job, look into what's on the other side of that gate and let us know exactly what we're up against, which then sends Logan to Paris. And when he arrives there, the place is totally wrecked. But when he gets there, there's something that actually gets to Logan, because amongst all this, he finds this blood dripping from like this wrecked car, and when he goes to check it out, this dude just jumps on him, only to tell Logan you're just like him, just before dying in Logan's arms. And when this happens, it reminds Logan of one of the reasons that he hates Omega Red the most, because in a way he feels like this guy is partially right, because in a number of ways Omega Red reminds Logan of his old self. And in some ways I can understand that, but for the most part, like when I think of old school Omega Red, in my mind I picture the ruthless, completely heartless, no remorse to like women, children, animals, like the Omega Red that just doesn't care. And I say that even in regards to before his mutant powers manifested, because before he actually needed to kill, it was something he was doing from his childhood, and as a result his parents and his brother were terrified of him. And that was something we got to learn a bit more about back with Team Weapon X, when his brother Vasily returned and used Omega Red by way of nanobots. And I got a link below to our most recent refresher on that, which I believe was around the time we were talking about the return of Wolverine. But this also reminds me of something which we had seen back at this time with Team Weapon X, which is something that I believe that has a high probability of coming around again, because at the time with Team Weapon X, which later had turned into Team Weapon X Force, but towards the latter part of this series, Sabretooth and Omega Red, they had grown a bit closer, and Sabretooth was like the first person to convince him that he was like more than a monster. And that's something I feel like we may see come back pretty soon, because upon Omega Red's arrival to Krakoa, he's been put under the observation of Dr. Cecilia Reyes, but even with doing so, his situation's more like a medical prison. And as far as Krakoan inmates go, how ironic is it that a recent friend is also locked up in there? And I mean, it's not like they're locked up close to each other or anything, but I feel like it's one of those things that it would just make a lot of sense to explore. Like, could you imagine them seeing each other in there and him asking Sabretooth, like, how long you serving? And Sabretooth being like, I was hoping you could tell me. Like, I think it would be pretty cool to build on top of that. But when Logan gets back, he tells Dr. Reyes and Magneto, like, this dude is beyond saving. And when him and Magneto continue this conversation, Magneto makes the argument that Omega Red is a mutant, and like any other mutant, he has the right to be here. And really, it's here where Wolverine Wolverine pushes a point that I've been trying to make since House of X. Because first Wolverine is like, there's children here, so what if he gets out of hand and something terrible happens? And Magneto's like, if something happens, we'll just resurrect him, no biggie. But Logan's like, sure, you can bring people back, but immortality does not erase trauma. And to me, like, that has been the biggest risk as far as just being able to bring people back, because like I said before, these experiences can change people. And it's like, who better to push this point than Wolverine, who has literally died before, and if not that, experienced trauma that should have killed him countless times. So it's like, take that and imagine a whole island of people dealing with these issues. But essentially, Logan's given the task of going in here, speaking to Omega Red, figuring out what he did, and after that, finding a solution to it. But while locked up in here, Omega Red, he is under restraint, which is something that Black Tom Cassidy had set up shortly after Omega Red fell unconscious after arriving in Krakoa. But it's here where Omega Red cooperates pretty quickly, and he tells Wolverine, as far as what he'd seen in Paris, like, what if it wasn't him who did it? And with him sharing this information with Wolverine and telling him to go back to Paris and telling him what to look for, we then get to see how a bit of it plays out even while they're having their conversation. Because sometime after this conversation, when Logan had actually went to Paris and he runs into this beautiful lady who tries to hand him some dog roses, or better yet, sell him some dog roses, it's here where it starts to get a little crazy. Because not long after meeting her, he then asks her if she wants to get a drink, and though she declines to offer, she does admit that she has business at the same club. And so Logan is like, bump it, I'm gonna go in here and I'm gonna drink anyway. But when he gets in there, he does notice like the heavy scent of perfumes and colognes, as if they're trying to cover up something. But even still, he goes in, orders a drink, and as soon as he sips, he sees everyone there, like literally just staring at him as if they're waiting for something. And I mean, like, the music stopped and everything. But when this happens, after he had taken a sip of that drink, he blacks out, and he wakes up not long after, tied up upside down. And if it hadn't been for his healing factor, he'd have been unconscious a lot longer. But as it turns out, this place is filled with vampires. And after they get Wolverine tied up here, they literally put him on a tap. And much like beer on a tap, they start drinking Wolverine's blood on a tap. But they don't get much of it before he gets to slicing, because I'd only imagine that that would hurt pretty bad, and as a result, he'd be highly upset. But it's also here where he's given help by the young lady who was selling the dog roses, who quickly gives off the impression that she's been hunting vampires for a while, like especially when she pulls out the UV gun and she just blasts a bunch of these dudes away. But even still, initially she doesn't tell Logan her name, but she does let him know that she had offered him the dog roses because they're just as effective to vampires as garlic. So when she came to him acting like she was trying to sell him some, it was more of a test, rather than her just being a flower lady on her spare time. But even still with this, keep in mind that we're still getting the conversation between Logan and Omega Red while this is happening. But even jumping back to that conversation, Omega Red then begins to explain to Logan like the whole situation with vampires and how it's changed since the establishment of the nation of Krakoa. And mainly because in the scope of everything, with the mutants rising to their prominence, this has in a way scattered the Homo sapiens who were at that #1 spot, and as a result, it's allowed other smaller groups to come together and rise in power. And this is exactly what the vampires have been doing. And they've even gone as far to bite people and lock them in catacombs for however long it takes waiting for them to turn, just as a way to bolster their numbers. And for Logan hearing this, even still he has a hard time believing Omega Red, who is someone who literally lives off of death. And to him, Omega Red, he's not too different from these vampires, with him literally draining the life from others and oftentimes even killing for sport. But it's also here where he asks Wolverine if he's familiar with the story of St. Julian, which was essentially about St. Julian who was hunting a stag, but before he could kill it, it had told him a prophecy about him being the cause of his parents' death. And so long story short, St. Julian had moved far away from his parents in hopes that he would prevent this from happening, but this had only then caused his parents to search after him, wondering why he had left. And when his parents had grown old and weary, they had finally found his home, but when they arrived to it, only his wife was there. And so his wife let them in, let them rest in their bed, and she rushed away to get a doctor to get them help. But later when St. Julian got home, he had just seen 2 bodies in the bed and he thought it was his wife having an affair. And in a blind rage, he had slain the both of them, fulfilling the prophecy. But with Omega Red telling this to Wolverine, he also lets him know that the ending of the story actually has a crazy twist. And if Logan wants to know that ending, he'll only get that answer in Paris. Which takes us back to the portion of the narrative where we see how that plays out. Because as it continues, we come to find out that Logan had tracked down that mysterious lady to whom, as it turns out, her name is Louise, and she's part of an ancient holy order called the Night Guard, which is an order that's been around for ages fighting against the vampire nation. But it's here where Logan teamed up with Louise as she geared up preparing to make her way to the catacombs underneath Paris. And with doing so, she offered Wolverine some vampire killing artillery, but of course he politely declined because, as we know, he's already got that covered. But as they make their way to the catacombs, it's also here where Logan asks Louise, how did the story of St. Julian end, with him being still curious from the story that Omega Red began to tell him. But just before she even gets the chance to tell him how the ending of that story played out, they trigger a trapdoor, which sends them to the bottom of the catacombs, and thinking quickly, Logan tells Louise to grab him so he can hold her above himself just before landing on the spikes below, which fortunately saves her life. But for Wolverine, it's like another one of those examples for the painless price he pays for having that healing factor. But with them landing here, a ton of vampires come after them, but unfortunately the fall broke Louise's UV gun, and as a result she's taken by one of the vampires from that same nightclub, and he tells Logan that he'll let her go if he gives him what he wants, which essentially is more of his blood, of which they all come for by the swarm. And it's pretty interesting, this fascination that they all have with Wolverine's blood, which I'll talk about a bit more in just a little bit. But with them doing this, Logan assures her that he's not going to turn into a vampire, which we know won't happen mainly because of his healing factor, which is one of those things I felt like we learned back when he lost his healing factor and actually turned into a vampire. But with all these vampires leaving the two of them alive, Wolverine had believed that this is because he killed their leader. But as it turned out, this guy wasn't their leader, but actually these vampires had taken the blood that they drank from Wolverine and took it to their real leader, who we soon come to find out is a figure to the vampires the same way that Professor X is to the mutants. Because the same way that the nation of Krakoa has Charles Xavier, the vampire nation has Dracula, and he has been collecting the blood of Wolverine and pumping it into his own body. And so now the crazy thing about this idea is, like, we're also shown this blood work analysis, which gives us this comparison to Wolverine's blood and the blood of a vampire. It's impervious to infection or any malignant disorders, and is capable of curing or healing when it's transferred into someone else, which is something we've seen recently in Savage Avengers when Wolverine's blood brought Brother Voodoo back to life. But also with that, once Wolverine's blood leaves his body, the benefits that it's capable of, they start to diminish, unlike a vampire's blood, which is perpetually infectious. But in summary, in comparison to a vampire's blood, it's not only like they're a type in their own class, but they're actually like the same type, one positive and one negative, which really makes it seem like Dracula is attempting to do a full body blood transfusion, which is an ambitious endeavor, unless you're somebody like Magic Johnson, who likely pulled this off in the mid-90s. But in the case of Omega Red, who was released shortly after, and with doing so he went back to Paris to meet with Dracula, and as it turns out, he had actually been working with Dracula this whole time, because the arrangement they had set in place, it was actually for Omega Red to bring Dracula Wolverine in exchange for the carbonadium synthesizer. And for those who don't know, the carbonadium synthesizer, it is something that Omega Red has been chasing for decades, because the carbonadium that is in him is actually killing him, which is one of the reasons why he has to absorb so much life in order to sustain his own. But with Dracula giving this to Omega Red, he essentially makes the deal with him to join with the mutants in Krakoa, but secretly still work with him, which is pretty wild. And I can't wait to see more of the both of these guys, whether it's in Wolverine or X-Force. But real quick, just want to give a shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you all for all of your support. And for anyone who wants more information on how to join, I got links below. Just head to patreon.com/DopeSpill. But yeah, man, like, the way this Wolverine series has started, it has me thinking of a lot of things. And like, not only with the comparison between Wolverine's blood and that of a vampire, but it also makes me curious of your cases like Blade, who was born a Daywalker, and it's like, so is he considered a mutant too? And does him and Wolverine have the same blood type? Because it's also like, if Franklin Richards is classified as a mutant, why wouldn't Blade be? I don't know, just speaking my mind. But you guys, you give me the spill down in the comments, and y'all let me know. And we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.